Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
It was one of those dinners that never really started with joy, but always seemed to end with a bitter taste, even if the food was flawless and the wine was poured with generous hands. My mother had made pot roast, her usual celebration dish, and it sat in the center of the table like a trophy she expected us all to admire before touching. The table was set too perfectly, with her good china and linen napkins folded like swans, because God forbid anything about our lives appear as mediocre as it truly was. My father, sitting at the head of the table, had already finished his first glass of wine before Brandon even showed up. I arrived exactly on time, as I always do, out of habit, not respect. I knew better than to expect acknowledgement for that. Brandon strolled in, 10 minutes late, flashing that rehearsed smile of his that still managed to fool them both. My mom lit up like a Christmas tree in Macy's window display. "There he is," she beamed, rising to kiss his cheek like he was some war hero coming home from battle. He shrugged off his coat like a movie star, tossing a script he didn't bother reading, took his place across from me, and gave me that smirk. The one that always said, "I'm still the favorite, sis, and you'll never catch up." We'd barely touched our food when it began. The ritual, the wound opening, the comparison that had become as natural as breathing in this house. My mother, not one to waste a chance to boost her golden boy's ego while slicing mine to ribbons, set down her fork and looked directly at me, her voice sweet like poison and honey. "Brandon just got promoted again. Director of Operations now. Isn't that incredible? He's only 35. You could learn something from him, Rachel." Her words hung in the air like a fart in church. Unwanted, unavoidable, and damn near choking. I didn't flinch. I just nodded slowly, reached into my purse, and pulled out a glossy, folded brochure. I handed it to my father, who squinted at it like he was reading a menu in a foreign language, and I said, in the most even voice I could muster, "Good, because his new boss just hired me as his consultant." And then I smiled. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was electric, charged, the kind of silence that reveals more than any screaming match ever could. My mother's face stiffened so fast it was like watching wet cement turn solid. My father lowered the brochure slowly, glancing between the three of us, as if waiting for someone to explain the punchline of a joke he didn't get. Brandon's mouth opened just slightly, like a man trying to protest, but realizing he doesn't even know which part of the explosion to address first. And that was the moment I realized the entire structure of my family was built on the illusion of control. My mother's tight grip on narrative, my father's passive agreement to her revisions of reality, and Brandon's smug assumption that being loved was the same as being right. What they didn't realize, and what I had learned to turn into a weapon, was that silence can cut just as deep as words. I'd spent years learning how to speak quietly and strike hard. As the conversation limped forward like a wounded animal, Mom tried to regain footing with something about how corporate consulting sounded vague and perhaps a little niche, as if implying I'd exaggerated my role. I didn't bother correcting her. Let her sit with it. Let her guess. Let Brandon sweat in his starched shirt and wonder how much I knew. Because the truth was, I'd known for weeks. I'd known about the shady invoices, the hush-hush deal with a vendor that looked a little too convenient, and the quiet whispers around the office that Brandon's charm had worn thinner than the soles of my dad's church shoes. But this wasn't the moment to reveal it. No, this was just the first breadcrumb. I'd spent my life sitting through dinners like these, swallowing resentment with every bite, pretending I didn't see the favoritism, didn't hear the digs, didn't feel the sting when they made it clear Brandon was their pride and I was their problem. So tonight, I gave them what they always wanted, a performance. One where I played the part of someone unaffected, unbothered, even impressed. It made the tension worse, and I liked it that way. Later that night, when I got home, I poured myself a drink, not to calm down, but to savor. Because for once, I hadn't just survived one of their dinners. I'd flipped the script, and none of them saw it coming. I leaned back on my couch, phone in hand, scrolling past a new email from Ruth, my best friend who worked in HR at Brandon's company. Subject line, You're not gonna believe what I just found." And for a brief moment, I smiled, not out of happiness, but anticipation. Now tell me this. Have you ever sat through a family dinner where someone said just one thing and suddenly the whole table changed? What would you have done if it was you they humiliated? Would you fight back or let it pass again? Think about it. Because for me, that night was the last time I let any of them believe I was the one who had to learn from anyone. Next time, they'll be the ones learning from me. It's always funny how the people you grow up with, the ones who share your childhood walls, your kitchen table, your family vacations that were more arguments than memories, can somehow turn into strangers in adulthood, carefully packaged in expensive suits and LinkedIn accomplishments, hiding behind their resumes and Instagram-ready smiles. Brandon had always played the role so well, from his early days of Little League and honor roll certificates to his first internship in a firm Dad knew someone at. He learned early that it wasn't just about being good, it was about looking good, about giving Mom something to brag about over coffee with her friends, something to hang on the fridge long after we were too old for magnets shaped like apples and stars. And yet, for all his polish, for all the praise they showered him with like confetti at a damn parade, I always knew there was a thin layer underneath, one that cracked the minute things didn't go his way. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was a knowing. You don't grow up watching someone get handed the world without learning where they hide the receipts. When we were in college, I came up with an idea for a campus startup, a tutoring service app, before those were a dime a dozen. I worked on it for weeks, built the outline, mapped out a business plan, even had a professor interested in backing it. One night, over drinks and a false sense of sibling bonding, I told Brandon about it. 2 months later, he launched something strikingly similar with his frat buddy as a co-founder and told everyone it was his brainchild. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, "Come on, Rachel, it's not like you were going to do anything with it anyway." That was the first time I realized he didn't just want to win. He wanted to win by erasing me from the scoreboard altogether. Now, over a decade later, here I was, sitting in a quiet office with soft lighting and polished furniture, reading over confidential files that painted a far more interesting portrait of my brother. Ruth, my friend since freshman year, and now a senior HR director at Brandon's company, sat across from me, flipping through her own copy of the documents with a grim look that told me this wasn't just about a few mistakes on a spreadsheet. The investigation Marla had hired me for was sensitive. Internal audit into a series of expense reports and vendor contracts that weren't lining up. Initially, it was thought to be a mid-level manager issue, maybe someone padding reimbursements or cutting side deals. But then Ruth saw Brandon's name, repeatedly, in places his signature shouldn't have been, on approvals that bypassed standard checks, attached to vendors that had no prior records with the company. The deeper we dug, the messier it got. A contract worth nearly 6 figures awarded to a consultancy firm that didn't seem to exist 2 years ago. A trail of reimbursement requests processed just hours before the quarterly cutoff, all approved at lightning speed. Emails forwarded to personal accounts. Nothing explosive yet, but enough red flags to turn a performance review into a legal matter. I didn't want to believe it was this easy. I thought he'd at least be smarter about covering his tracks. But that was the thing about Brandon. He'd never really had to be careful. He'd never been questioned, never been told no, not by our parents, not by his supervisors, not even by the women who orbit him like moths to a flame, mistaking his curated charm for genuine character. The next day, while sipping a lukewarm coffee in a corner cafe that smelled like burnt toast and vanilla air freshener, I got the message. "We need to talk," it read, just that. No greeting, no signature, but I didn't need one. Brandon didn't like phones for anything other than self-promotion. So a direct text like that meant he knew. Not everything, but enough to feel the ground shift beneath him. I waited a moment, then replied, "Tomorrow, your office, noon." I wasn't going there to accuse him, not yet. I wanted to see how he'd play it, what kind of story he'd spin, how many excuses he'd summon before the mask slipped. I wanted to give him a chance, to hang himself with his own words. Because beneath all of this wasn't just justice or some high-minded need for ethical closure. No, it was simpler than that. I wanted him to feel, for once, what I'd felt every holiday, every birthday, every moment Mom looked through me to brag about him. I wanted him to taste the discomfort of being under the microscope, of not knowing who's on your side, of realizing too late that the rules of the game just changed and you're no longer the one holding the cards. That evening, as I sat on my couch, legs tucked under me, documents spread out like puzzle pieces on my coffee table, I thought about what it meant to go after your own blood. It wasn't easy, no matter how justified it felt. There's a line you cross when you stop pretending family loyalty trumps self-respect. And once it's crossed, you can't go back. But maybe, just maybe, some families don't deserve that kind of loyalty. Maybe some families need to be rebuilt from the ashes of their own illusions. So I prepared. I memorized every number, every inconsistency, every timestamp that proved he wasn't just sloppy, he was arrogant. And I smiled, not out of joy, but anticipation, because if there's one thing Brandon never expected, it was that the sister he spent years overlooking had finally looked right back and seen everything. Tomorrow would be the beginning of his education. And I planned to be a very, very thorough teacher. When I walked into Brandon's office the next day, the air was so thick with tension it might as well have been a second skin, wrapping itself around the mahogany desk, the oversized leather chair he was too proud of, and the wall of self-congratulatory plaques that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with connections. He was already seated, trying to look casual, but the tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his cufflinks betrayed the effort. The moment he saw me, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled like we were two old friends catching up after a family wedding, instead of two siblings playing chess with careers, legacies, and reputations as the pieces on the board. "Thanks for coming," he said. His voice dipped in that fake warmth he used when he wanted something. It was the same tone he used when borrowing money from our parents in his 20s, and the same one he'd used to charm his way out of speeding tickets and bad dates. But I wasn't some girlfriend he could ghost after a few flattering texts, and this wasn't a misunderstanding he could brush aside with a charming laugh and a clap on the back. I didn't respond right away. I sat down, crossed my legs, opened my notebook slowly, and waited until he felt the weight of my silence. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers laced like a preacher mid-sermon. "Look, Rachel, I don't know what you think you found or what you think this is, but there's a lot of politics in this company, and sometimes shortcuts have to be taken. You get that, right? You're not naive." His voice had dipped into condescension now, like I was the little sister again, reading his high school essays and circling typos while he flirted with my friends. It was almost admirable, really, how confidently he carried himself, even when the ground beneath him was actively crumbling. But I knew Brandon, knew how he deflected with charm, softened accusations with vague apologies, and how he could look someone in the eye and lie with the conviction of a priest. So I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. I let him string his rope, word by word, until the weight of it would hang over him. He tried to spin the narrative into one of stress and overwork, said he had been delegating, and that some of the approvals must have slipped through, and insisted he had nothing to hide. But what struck me most wasn't the lies. It was the assumption that I would accept them, that after a lifetime of being compared to him, dismissed in favor of him, and used as the cautionary tale to his success story, I would once again let him off the hook because family comes first. Because blood is thicker than truth. I waited until he'd finished, then calmly reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, one of several I had prepared with every document, every signature, every email printed and time-stamped. I didn't slide it across the table like in the movies. I placed it gently on my lap, opened it, and let the pages rest there. Like cards I wasn't ready to play just yet. "You know," I said, finally breaking the silence, "I used to think Mom and Dad loved you more because you were easier to love. You gave them things to brag about. But now I think they just saw what they wanted to see and ignored the rest. Because it was simpler that way. You weren't better. You were just more convenient. His expression shifted, ever so slightly, a flicker of something real, panic maybe, or guilt, or the first sting of losing control. I'm not here because I want to hurt you, I continued, my voice even, measured. I'm here because someone has to clean up the mess, and it's always been me, hasn't it? You wreck things and I pick them up. You lie and I stay quiet. You shine and I get out of the way. He tried to speak, but I raised my hand. Not aggressively, just firmly. But not this time, I added. This time you're going to feel what it's like when someone doesn't let it slide. Later that night, while going through the final report draft, my phone pinged. It was an anonymous email, no subject, no signature, just a single attachment, another internal memo, one I hadn't seen, linking Brandon to an older vendor deal, predating even Ruth's files. It was clean, simple, and damning. I stared at it for a long time, the cursor hovering over the file, a strange knot forming in my stomach. Not from fear, but from recognition. The memo had been forwarded to me from my father's private account. I sat back, stunned, the weight of it crashing through the walls I'd built to stay focused. My father, silent, detached, always in the corner at dinners, letting Mom run the show, never once raising his voice or stepping in during our fights, had known. Not only had he known, he had protected Brandon. For how long, and why now? Why send it to me? Was it guilt, or was it a warning? I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up reading the memo over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves and offer a simpler answer. But they didn't. Instead, they burned deeper into my mind, pulling me back through years of small betrayals, of my father's quiet shrugs and evasive silences. And I realized with growing certainty that Brandon wasn't the only one who'd been playing me. The next move wouldn't be about corporate policy or HR procedure. It would be about truth. And truth, once unearthed, doesn't just destroy the guilty. It shatters the ones who stood by and watched too. There are moments in life when a truth, once revealed, does not hit you all at once like a wrecking ball, but instead seeps in slowly, like a persistent leak behind the wall, warping everything it touches until you can no longer pretend the house you built isn't starting to rot from within. That's how it felt when I sat alone in my apartment, the anonymous memo from my father still glowing on my laptop screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat that refused to stop. It wasn't just that he had sent it. It was that he had known, probably for longer than I wanted to admit, and in that quiet complicity, he had become something far worse than an enabler. He had become a keeper of the lie. And not just Brandon's lie, but the family's lie. The pristine version of us that my mother sold to her book club and holiday newsletters. The illusion of balance and success and proper, respectable children. But now I saw it differently, all of it, as if someone had yanked a dusty sheet off a sculpture, and what was underneath wasn't what I thought we'd built. It was what we'd been trying to hide. I didn't rush to confront him. I needed to be sure that what I was feeling wasn't just another symptom of old childhood resentment rising to the surface like bile. I spent 2 days digging deeper, combing through old emails, financial reports, even family tax documents that I'd accessed years ago when helping with my parents' estate planning. And in between the lines of charitable donations and meticulously itemized deductions, I saw patterns I hadn't noticed before. Investment trails, corporate ties that aligned suspiciously with some of Brandon's now suspect vendor connections. They weren't illegal on their face, but they were intimate enough to suggest more than coincidence. By the time I showed up at my parents' house on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I already knew what I was going to say. My mother wasn't home, her car was gone, no doubt parked outside the country club, where she was probably telling someone's wife how well Brandon was doing and how Rachel's a bit private, but she's fine. She's figuring things out. My father opened the door wearing his usual neutral expression, the one that had always annoyed me even more than his silences. and invited me in with a nod that felt less like affection and more like obligation. I didn't sit. I didn't ask how he was. I stood in the foyer, dripping slightly from the rain, and pulled out the printed memo like it was a search warrant. He looked at it, then at me, and for a moment I thought he might pretend he didn't know what it was. But he didn't. He just sighed, that slow, exhausted kind of sigh that sounds like a man surrendering to something he knows he should have faced years ago. "You knew," I said, and my voice didn't crack, though I could feel the pressure building behind my ribs like a storm surge. "You knew about what Brandon's been doing, and you chose to say nothing. Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly to the living room, sat down in his favorite chair, and motioned for me to join him, but I stayed where I was. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the years had shrunk him down into something closer to his truth. A man who watched things unfold and convinced himself that silence was the same thing as neutrality. "I didn't know everything," he finally said, "but I knew enough to be worried." "Then why didn't you stop him?" I asked, not out of anger, but out of genuine confusion. Because for all his detachment, I'd always believed there was a line my father wouldn't cross. And now I wasn't sure there ever was one. He stared at the floor for a long time, then said something I'll never forget. "Because in this family, we don't expose each other. We survive each other." It was such a hollow, broken philosophy that I felt something inside me shift permanently. My whole life, I'd been operating under the belief that fairness mattered, that truth was worth something, that loyalty had to be earned, not just given because of shared blood. But here was my father confirming what I had always suspected, that in our house, loyalty meant silence, and silence was the price of keeping the illusion intact. "So you protected him," I said, not as a question but as a conclusion, "and let me be the one they judged. The one who was never enough, never quite right." He looked up at me then, and for once I saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or fear, or both. "I thought you were stronger," he said. "I thought you didn't need it the way he did." It wasn't an apology, it was an explanation, and it made me want to scream because in that single sentence, he confirmed every unspoken hierarchy that had governed our family for decades. Brandon got protected because he was fragile, because he might break if someone told him no. And I was expected to be the one who absorbed the damage and kept walking. I left without another word, the memo still in my hand, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to take back something from that house, something real. As I drove away, windshield wipers beating rhythmically against the glass, I knew what I had to do next. It wasn't about Brandon anymore, or even the company. It was about breaking the spell that held this family together. A spell made of denial, of favoritism masquerading as love, of passive fathers and performative mothers, and children forced into roles they never chose. When I got back to my apartment, Ruth was waiting. She had more documents, more confirmations, more firewood for the bonfire I was about to light. But before we started, she asked me one question that stopped me cold. "If this burns everything down," she said quietly, "do you want to be the one standing in the ashes?" I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know, not yet. But I knew I couldn't keep living under someone else's version of loyalty. And sometimes the only way to rebuild is to destroy the thing pretending to be whole. The morning Brandon was scheduled for his meeting with HR was one of those gray, suffocating days where the sky hangs too low and the air feels like it's pressing against your skin, as if the universe itself is holding its breath for what's about to unfold. I woke up early, not out of nerves, but because anticipation had taken up permanent residence in my body, pulsing quietly in my veins like a second heartbeat. I didn't wear anything dramatic, just a dark blazer and clean lines, the kind of outfit that whispered competence without trying too hard, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I'd already done the work. I had planted every seed. Now it was time to watch what grew in the absence of control. At exactly 9:30, my phone lit up. One missed call from Brandon. No voicemail, no text. Just a single blinking signal of desperation. I didn't call him back. I didn't need to. By the time I arrived at the building, the tension was already thick in the lobby. Assistants avoided eye contact. Phones rang unanswered a little longer than usual. The receptionist, who normally greeted me with a forced smile and fake politeness, couldn't even muster the mask. She just nodded. Everyone knew something was happening. They didn't know what. But they could feel the hierarchy shifting, the tectonic plates of the workplace tilting beneath their feet. That's the thing about power. It's invisible until it moves. I was escorted into a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city like a throne room designed for corporate war. And Ruth was already seated, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. Across from us sat Marla, composed as always, a woman who had made a career out of turning threats into assets and liabilities into leverage. Brandon arrived 5 minutes later, a tight smile on his face, wearing a suit that suddenly seemed too expensive for the moment. He looked at me for the first time, not as his sister, not as some background figure he could manipulate or ignore, but as a legitimate threat. That recognition alone was worth every sleepless night I'd spent piecing this together. The meeting began formally, with Marla laying out the scope of the internal audit, citing compliance breaches, irregular approvals, and discrepancies in vendor contracts. Brandon listened with the blank expression of someone trying to calculate which version of the truth would cost him the least. But when Ruth began speaking, her voice crisp, detailed, relentless in its clarity, the walls began to crack. Every name, every document, every time-stamped email was laid out like a surgical dissection, and with each new detail, Brandon's posture shifted. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was leaning forward, elbows on the table, jaw tight, hands clenched in fists too tight to hide. He tried to interrupt once, twice, but each time, Marla shut him down with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a quiet, "Let her finish." And then, just when the silence in the room reached a pitch that seemed unbearable, I pulled out the final piece, the vendor connection tied not just to Brandon's misuse of authority, but to one of our family's old acquaintances, someone our father had once done business with, a name innocuous on the surface, but insidious in its implications. The implication wasn't just mismanagement. It was nepotism, favoritism, and calculated deceit that could have long-term repercussions for the company's credibility. Brandon's mouth opened slightly, a breath caught in the back of his throat, but nothing came out. Not denial, not anger, just a terrible dawning awareness that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I turned on the speakerphone and dialed my parents. My mother answered, her voice chipper and oblivious as always. "Rachel, is everything all right?" I didn't respond directly. Instead, I said clearly into the receiver, "Mom, you were right. I should have learned from Brandon." And I did. I learned how to pretend I wasn't a threat. I learned how to lie by omission. I learned how to weaponize silence. And most of all, I learned how to wait. There was a pause on the other end. No gasp, no protest, just silence, which told me everything I needed to know. I hung up without another word. Brandon didn't look at me again. He stared at the table, jaw working like he was chewing gravel, and Marla gently closed her folder. "This will be handled internally," she said, with a professionalism that didn't bother pretending there was any future discussion needed. By the time I stepped outside, the city hadn't changed. Cars still moved, people still rushed to meetings. The world spun as it always had. But something fundamental had shifted in me. I wasn't the ignored daughter anymore, or the background sibling, or the family failure dressed up as the cautionary tale. I was something else now, something they didn't yet have a name for. The next week, Brandon took a leave of absence for personal reasons. It was buried in the internal memo, just like I knew it would be. My parents didn't call. My mother posted a quote about growth through adversity on her Facebook page, which I'm sure was meant to convey something noble. My father sent me a one-line email. "You did what you thought was right." I didn't reply. People ask sometimes if revenge is worth it, if setting things right feels as good as you expect. The truth is, it doesn't feel good. Not in the way movies make it seem. It feels heavy, it feels final. It feels like a door closing behind you that you know will never open again. But it also feels necessary, because justice, when you've lived too long without it, is not about making others hurt. It's about not letting yourself be erased. And maybe, just maybe, that's all I ever wanted. Not to win, but to be seen.